So in the very nice presentation before, we saw and very clearly what kind of big risks we have from pesticide use. And in my presentation, I want to highlight some kind of solutions that we could envision to actually reduce pesticide risk. And in my presentation, I want to start from a kind of global pesticide policy framework and then go into two specific case studies which illustrate some kind of solutions where we actually were researching on the ground. My name is Niklas MOHRING, as you already introduced me, and I'm currently a Marie Curie fellow at the Resilience Group at CNRS in France. And the work I'm presenting today is partly also, of course, with Robert Finger at the Agricultural Economics and Policy Group at ETH Zurich, but also current work at my group here in France. So I just want to quickly remind ourselves of the problem again. So on the one hand, so this is of course a very dual problem, because on the one hand, pest management is in agricultural cropping systems, it's actually very critical for food security. And there's an author that was also invited but couldn't participate, who showed that, for example, 30% of global crops would be lost to pest without pesticide use. So we have a real problem if we don't apply any pest management. And the problem is not going to diminish in the future, but rather going to increase, because projections actually show that in the future, under climate change, we will have an increase in pest pressure, but we will also have an increase in food demand. And this is because of changing dietary patterns, but also because of population growth. But we also know that current pest management practices that heavily rely on pesticide use cause a wide range of adverse effects on human health and the environment, both on local and global scales. And we saw a very good illustration of this in the presentation before. And that's because of those big risks, actually, that a lot of policy actors and societal actors actually in the past stepped in the ring and were trying to tackle this problem of pesticide risk and reducing pesticide risk. So we know, for example, that since 10 years, we have the Directive 2009/128 from the European Union, which enforces member states to actually set national action plans to reduce pesticide risk. And since 1 year, we also know of the From Farm to Fork strategy of the European Union, which envisions actually an even stronger pesticide risk reduction of up to 50%. So the question is, how can we reduce actually pesticide risk by 50%? That's a very good question, because if you look in the past, the last 10 years, we actually see that there's little evidence that these action plans have actually achieved a reduction in pesticide risk. So we know, for example, the Ecophyto plan in France, which has received a lot of funding and so on. But if we look at the numbers, we don't see a lot of reduction. And this was the reason why we actually wrote this paper, Pathways for Advancing Pesticide Policies. So we wanted to describe pathways to a successful reduction of potential pesticide risk from agricultural pesticide use. And we wanted to show and identify economic, ecological, and societal trade-offs in these papers, and actually suggest 10 points to improve current pesticide policies. So, for example, we are talking about pesticide risk indicators that are currently not used in national action plans. We are talking about aligning policy targets, and we are talking about how to create a better and more sustainable food systems. An important aspect of our paper was that we tried to develop a holistic and interdisciplinary framework that spans across the whole food value chain. So this is the figure you see in the bottom here. And here we wanted to highlight, and this was also highlighted in presentations yesterday on nitrogen use, that the problem is not only with farmers and their use of pesticides, which are of course a key actor, but also lies before and after in the food value chain. So, for example, with input suppliers, food industry, and consumers, which make choices about the food products that are produced. And in this paper, so a major message of this paper was actually that we need holistic solutions across food value chains, and also we need to consider the whole socio-ecological systems because it's not only about the farmer's choices in a socio-economic system, but the farmer is also embedded in a wider socio-ecological system from which he actually profits from the production, in which he severely influences with, for example, pesticide use. And in my presentation today, I want to present you 2 case studies which illustrate this holistic solution across food value chain actors, and this actually taking into account socio-ecological systems in solutions. So the first case study tells us something about the necessity for holistic solutions along food value chains. And the case I want to present you here is the case of pesticide-free wheat in Switzerland. So the starting point for this case is a long time ago, since around 30 years, the farmer organization EP-Swiss actually produces extensive wheat in Switzerland, which means that the farmers are only allowed to use herbicides and seed treatments in wheat production. And this is a successful example of private-public partnership for pesticide-reduced production, actually, because on the one hand side, this is supported by food industry because there's a certain label and this is marketed on the Swiss market. And on the other hand, this is also actually supported by the Swiss government with direct payments. And this is a very successful label because 50% of Swiss wheat is actually produced under this label. And now the producer organization EP-Swiss actually wanted to go one step further and is currently establishing a totally pesticide-free wheat production program. So also eliminating herbicides and seed treatments from wheat production. And this new label was then also supported by the most important and major supermarket chain in Switzerland, Migros. And they promised to only sell pesticide-free bread from 2023 on. So only that would already mean that by 2023, 20% of Swiss wheat would have to produce without any pesticides. And we were in the situation that we were able to support the establishment of this kind of production system. And I want to give you a short timeline here of this interaction, actually. So we had 2 research projects in this context, which were called Herbie-free and Pesty-free projects. And this started in 2017 and 18, when EP-Swiss actually considered to establish pesticide-free production. So they were actually trying to step up this program that I already talked to you about. And in the 2018, we then started the Herbie-free project, which was an ex-ante simulation of the potential economic and environmental effects of the program. So there were, of course, a lot of important questions for the producer organization and also for the partners who wanted to market this product. So what are potential effects on yields, revenues, and profits if we eliminate pesticides? What could be the geographic heterogeneity and trade-offs of this kind of production systems? And we try to answer this with the help of a bioeconomic model. And I later want to give you some details on this. In 2018 and 19, the producer organization then decided, based on our results, that this kind of program was actually feasible. And they introduced a first pilot program of this pesticide-free wheat production. And in 2019 and 20, this program was then opened up for all kind of producers. And again, we provided them with expertise here. And there were, of course, a lot of important questions because they knew from the beginning that this should not only be a niche product, but this should be a large-scale program. So we provided them with an analysis of adoption decisions and barriers actually for this kind of program. So the questions they had, for example, were how many and which kind of farmers will adopt this kind of program? And what are the potential adoption barriers and challenges for a successful program? So how can we design the program in a way that we have a large-scale adoption rate? And what we did in order to answer this kind of questions were a large-scale survey and econometric analysis. And again, I want to present you these results later. Then this program was opened up and is currently running, and around 10% of Swiss wheat producers are already producing under this program. Then I just want to give you a quick overview of this production programs, because I think it's important to have in mind what kind of trade-offs we are talking about here. So you see in this table the different kind of wheat production programs in Switzerland that are currently existing. You have on the left-hand side the conventional production, then you have the extensive production I was talking about, you have the pesticide-free production, and you have the organic production. So maybe a short word of information. What's the difference between pesticide-free and organic? In pesticide-free, you're not allowed to use any pesticides in wheat production, but you're still allowed to use synthetic fertilizers. And in the rest of your crop rotation, you're actually free to use whatever you want. So basically, this is a higher degree of freedom for the farmer comparison to organic, where in Europe, we actually have quite strict restrictions, and organic is often employed on a farm level. You see the trade-offs here. So going from conventional to organic, the yields actually decrease. What's important to notice is that this kind of pesticide-free production, it's actually in the middle. So it's actually a good trade-off between organic and conventional, where you don't lose so much yields in comparison to organic practices. You see the market price. So conventional, you have a pure, say, market price, which is paid on the wheat market. Then in extensive, you get a price premium for your extensor labels. This is paid by the consumer. And in pesticide-free production, then you get an additional price markup compared to extensor. And what's important to notice is you have Swiss price levels here. So the prices you see, they seem to be very high for us, coming from Europe, maybe from the US or wherever else. But you have to notice that the Swiss market is quite, like, let's say it's like an island, a bit like in Europe, with closed borders, and price levels are quite high overall. So that you actually have to see the difference between pesticide-free and organic production, for example, where you see that the price, the market price that is paid is actually a lot higher. So that farmers who are not willing to go to organic, they can go to pesticide-free, but they don't get the same compensation. And then you see the same for federal direct payments that are getting consecutively higher, going from conventional to organic. So what I wanted to show you here is there's, of course, a trade-off between yields, pesticide reduction, and the adoption potential, because conventional production is adopted by a lot of farmers, extensive production as well, but pesticide-free production might be harder, and organic might even be more harder for farmers to adopt. Then I want to go to the first part of analysis, which is the ex-ante evaluation of the program. And what you see here on the left is the simulated yield losses in pesticide-free production. So this was before the introduction of the program. You see in yellow, medium yield losses, in green, lower yield losses, and in red, high yield losses. And this simulation model was actually based on very detailed data, especially explicit data on past yields, on wheat pressure, and on growing conditions in these regions. And the general outcome of this analysis was that the program is economically feasible for producers. So the results show on average that there are moderate yield losses of around 6%, but on the other hand, increasing revenues. And this is because of those additional price premiums and the additional direct payments. So on average, farmers should be actually intend to join the program, speaking from a purely economic point of view. But what we also see in this map, of course, is that there's a heterogeneous distribution of those costs of adoption, basically. So this is important to take into account in later analysis also. The main substitute in our model for herbicide use is mechanical weed control. And so this also highlights again that you don't get anything for free, right? So you're reducing pesticide use, but you're increasing mechanical weed control, which means you're actually trading off pesticide use with increased emissions and with lower soil conservation in a lot of cases. One question we could not answer, of course, in this analysis, in this ex-ante analysis, is the role of farmer behavior, which is very critical for adoption of these sustainable programs. So we see a lot of policy tools, a lot of models that are that seem to be actually attractive for farmers to adopt. But we also know from experience and from past studies that farmer behavior plays a critical role in in the adoption and should be taken into account. And moreover, you see that there are quite heterogeneous production conditions, and we don't know how that will actually influence farmer adoption decisions. So the question in the end is, how high is the actual adoption potential for this kind of program? And we try to answer this kind of question in our ex post evaluation of the adoption decision. And what you see here, again, on the left-hand side is a map of potential and actual adoption of farmers. So what you see in green are the farmers that actually already adopted the program in 2019, 2020, when we conducted the survey. You see in yellow the farmers who intended to adopt in the future, and you see in red the farmers that actually responded negative, so who didn't want to adopt at all. And how did we conduct this analysis? We had a large-scale survey with all EP Swiss producers. So this were over 4,700 producers we actually invited to participate. And we had a response rate of around 23%, which is quite good for this kind of surveys. And we asked them about their actual and planned adoption decisions, their farm and farmer characteristics, and about farmer behavior. We, of course, tested this kind of data if it's representative, and we found we were quite satisfied with that. And we then added to the survey data spatially explicit structural data. So this is spatially explicit data on weather, past yields, pest pressure, farm and farmer characteristics, and growing conditions in the regions. And we then constructed a conceptual and empirical adoption model. And we simulated, we basically tried to identify the adoption determinants of adoption. So first of all, the descriptive result was that there's an adoption potential of 58% of current extensor producers. And this is split up in 44% of farmers who said they intended to participate in the future, and 40% of respondents who were already participating in the program when we conducted the survey. So this is a good message, of course, for EP Swiss who know that there's a large-scale adoption potential for this kind of program. We then identified potential barriers for adoption, and we found that there's a key role of economic and environmental expectations of farmers on the one hand side. So the higher they actually expect benefit from the program to be, apart from the actual benefits, the more likely they were to participate in the program. But there was also an important role of environmental expectations. So when they actually expected that this kind of program would have a positive benefit for the environment, they were much more likely to participate in the program. There was then also important role of risk and availability of substitutes. So here again, we are talking about, for example, is there a certain knowledge of farmers available? Are there machinery available to substitute pesticide use? So this is an important practical question to put in place such kind of programs. Then there's an important role of spatial information spillovers, which we are looking at in another paper. So when you have neighbors who have already adopted or who have knowledge in this kind of production, you're actually much more likely to also adopt such kind of programs. And what was very surprising to us was, so looking again at the map before, where you see this heterogeneity over regions, was that there's no importance of structural farmer and farmers characteristics for the adoption decision. And this was also very important information for EP Swiss to design the program. A question which we can, of course, not answer with this analysis is there a high potential for other crops and for other countries? But I will later discuss this question in my conclusions. So what I wanted to present you in this case study is that we can use ex ante and ex post evaluation tools to support actors to put into place actually pesticide-free production programs. And we can inform them about potential impacts and trade-offs, adoption potential, barriers and implications for program design. And we are, of course, in this provision, we have the challenge of timely providing them with this kind of tools, because often the industry is going one step further without leaving the time for a thorough analysis. So we have to put into place actually tools which could provide timely analysis. So this is a major challenge in this kind let's say, aid to policymakers and to industry. The conclusion from the case study was that a large-scale establishment of a pesticide-free wheat production program in Switzerland seems possible, and moderate expected yield losses can be compensated by direct payments and price premia, which are gained on the market. And there's a high adoption potential across farm types. So how can we explain that this heterogeneity of farm and farmers characteristics did not play an important role in adoption? And we think this is because actually the compensation is high enough that with different kind of limitations that you might have on your farms, you're still able to gain a higher revenue in the end than in the production system before. What's important in this regard is that you were able to put into place a system which is actually reliable for farmers on the one hand side, and which can actually compensate them for not using any pesticides. And this is because they were working closely together with retailers and producer organizations, which means that there's already ready-made marketing channels for farmers where they can deliver the wheat, they can actually process the wheat separately, and they can market that later in the supermarket and gain a price premium for those kind of products. In this program, there's a high potential to reduce actual pesticide loads because wheat is a major culture in all over Europe and also in Switzerland, with occupying a lot of hectares of land all over Europe. And we have to also say that there are trade-offs in policy goals. So we saw that there's a trade-off, for example, between lower pesticide use, soil conservation, greenhouse gas emissions, and productivity. So we have to take into account this kind of trade-offs when we design such kind of programs. Farmers, they need support to actually implement this kind of programs. So they need knowledge and they need access to affordable substitutes. And here research again can play an important role to provide those kind of substitutes. And we should not forget that there's a key role of farmers' expectation and perception. So for example, of the economic and environmental situation when they choose to adopt or not. And these kind of questions are actually to a large part not answered yet. So how is farmers' decision-making at the interface of those complex and interlinked socioeconomic and ecosystems? And this kind of question I would like to shortly touch in my second case study here. So here I want to talk about how we can get a better understanding of decision-making in complex socio-ecosystems. Because farmers' decisions are actually made in a very complex systems where socioeconomic and ecosystems are embedded in each other. And the decisions of farmers have feedbacks and affect production potential in the future and pest control in the future again. So you can see the figure here on the right-hand side, where the farmer not only has to think about pesticide use, but also land use practices, machinery use, and so on. But at the same time, the farmer is not aware of future pest pressure, of interactions between pests, of interactions at the landscape level, of environmental variables, for example, such as weather, which will occur in the future, and so on. And farmers' decisions will have effects on production right now, so direct effects, but also feedback, again, on future decisions. So what I want to highlight here is that this decision-making process of farmers is very complicated. But on the other hand, there's a central role of farmer behavior for the adoption of these kind of sustainable production practices. So we actually have to better understand farmer behavior. And in the past, there have, for example, been papers that have shown that there's a strong uncertainty, information loss or not availability of information, that risk perception of farmers and their preferences play an important role in adoption, and that their objectives and habits can be quite different and heterogeneous and can play an important role for adoption. Additionally, we have a heterogeneity of agroecosystems. So each agroecosystem can be quite different. And we have quite a heterogeneity of farmer behavior and preferences as well. So all of this makes it very complicated to analyze farmers' decisions in these complex socio-ecosystems. And to answer this kind of question, we actually require to use interdisciplinary research linking an understanding of complex socio-ecosystems and farmer behavior. And this is the goal of the scholarship projects that I'm currently working in. So I'm working for 3 years on these 2 scholarship projects that have been mentioned earlier at the Resilience Group at the Centre d'études biologiques Chaussée. So me as an agriculture economist embedded in a group of ecologists actually, and we are trying to combine concepts, methods, and theory from economics and ecology to understand questions of farmers' decision-making processes, especially linked to pesticide use. So we are trying to improve our understanding of farmers' pesticide use decisions and their economic and ecological impacts and drivers. And for example, identify win-win situations where farmers could reduce their pesticide use while not using any revenues, and also at the same time improve the ecology of the social ecosystem. And this research is located in the Zone Atelier Plaine de Val de Sèvres. And this is actually a long-term socio-economic research area that was funded almost 30 years ago now. And it covers around 450 square kilometers and around 430 farmers. And the goal of this research zone is a long-term monitoring of biodiversity, ecological functions, soil farming practices, and farmers' characteristics. And since this Zone Atelier is already in place since around 30 years, we actually have quite a long-term data series on this, which allows us to, at the same time, look at economic and ecological drivers and impacts of decisions. And the major research approach here is actually not to only sit in our offices and think about solutions ourselves, but also work with the farmers on the field actually. So not have field trials where we try out new practices, but work on the farm with the farmers in social ecological experiments. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope we can stay connected. The last part of the research is, of course, work in progress. So if you're interested in this kind of research, I invite you to stay connected, and I'm happy to provide the results soon.
Thank you so much, Niklas, for this very nice presentation and this case study of in the Swiss area, which shows that it is possible to reduce pesticide. It was not possible in the case of France in the Ecophyto that you were talking about. Maybe Julie or Alain could help us to understand what is the difference between the Swiss and the French case. So Julie, you have the floor for 5 minutes of discussion, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you for having me. Hi, Niklas.
Hi.
So thank you for this very nice presentation. I had already had the opportunity to hear it a few months ago, and today again, I found it very nice and interesting. In particular, I really like the fact that you, as a researcher, has participated and followed the whole process of the design, implementation, and evaluation of a public program. Probably it helps a lot understanding the way governments are likely to tackle environmental issues. So I thought of 2 things while listening to you speak. The first one is, at start, you talked about holistic solutions that would take into account all the stakeholders along the value chains. But in the case you presented, the public program targets farmers mainly. So the government compensated the farmers for applying mechanical weed control instead of using herbicides. And it works pretty well, actually, provided farmers were not already enrolled in a soil conservation program. So this is an example of a program that targeted one specific agent along the value chain. And one could imagine a program that targets, for example, consumers, mainly a policy that would increase the attractiveness of zero pesticide food, for example, so that the zero pesticide agriculture becomes profitable. So at the end, I was wondering is it the solution that should be holistic, or simply our understanding of the problem that needs to be holistic? Given that the public resources are limited, shouldn't we put all the effort on one key agent or one key market? What do you think?
Thanks. That's a good question. So maybe I try to make it a bit clear with what I mean with holistic solutions. So I think on the one hand side, there's a monetary compensation, which is of course important to compensate farmers for a lot of economic losses, because I mean, we have to see that they are of course in a bind there. They're already often on the margin of economic revenues, and now we are asking them to change practices, and that costs them again money, that they would lose yields and so on. So we have to compensate them somehow. And of course, a good solution is here that on the one hand side, the government compensates them, which is, I think, fair enough, because they actually help to conserve certain ecosystem services and so on. And on the other hand, consumers compensate them because they pay the price markup. But I think what's often overlooked, and what was a very important component in this program, was why this worked so well, was because there's actually a whole food value chain behind that was actually functioning in the direction of the program. And let me explain this a bit. So what I mean here is this kind of program was already in place, the extensive program, since 30 years in Switzerland. So what they actually did since 30 years is that they were breeding varieties which could, for example, withstand the pressure of fungi and so on, which were adapted for this kind of production. So on the one hand side, you have actually inputs for the farmers, which enable them to grow this kind of wheat. Then you have all the knowledge of machinery production of farmers around, which enables them to put into place such kind of practices. And then after production, the farmers, they actually need somebody who takes this kind of wheat, because to sell that separately, you also, of course, have to store that separately. You have to process that separately. And afterwards, you have to put on a label. You have to bake that separately to make some bread, and you have to put on a label. So if this kind of whole food value chain is not in place, then you would actually quite quickly have a barrier there for farmers in the adoption decision, because no farmer actually wants to produce some wheat where they are not sure, I cannot give it somewhere close to me. For example, you would need to have in the whole country kind of silos which separately store that and so on. So I think this is often overlooked, that we need this kind of cooperation along the food value chain. And that's maybe not even a monetary compensation by the state, but somehow enabling those actors to work together actually, and to create those holistic food value chains, which enable farmers then to produce. And I think that's a very important aspect.
I agree. Thanks. Raja, do we have some?
It depends if you have other questions, Julie. Come on,
a short one. Yeah. A short one. Yeah. Yes, a short comment actually. It relates. It is pretty much on the same line, and it relates to the heterogeneity of farmers that are likely to be enrolled in public program, and the fact that the Swiss program you presented targeted all the farmers who grow wheat. It made me think of the debate on whether we should target all the farmers with the view of changing their practices a bit, as opposed to a policy that would target some specific farmers with the view to changing their practices a lot. In the case of pesticides, at least in France, at least for me, it is not so clear whether we should focus on those guys who are likely to stop pesticides totally, or on the majority of those who are likely to reduce a little bit the use of pesticides. So maybe Alain would have a different view from mine, but do you have some insights from the Swiss case on this kind of, I would say, land sparing debate?
So, yeah, I think that's one of the key questions, right? And that's what we wanted to show actually in this paper, Pathways for Advancing Pesticide Policies. And it's not one pathway, right? So that was our main message, was there cannot be one pathway. There have to be different pathways for different kind of farmers. So we will always have this kind of farmer who wants to produce a lot, and main interest is basically producing a lot of yield and so on. And that might also be important for food security. But then we have to offer this kind of farmer a pathway to reduce pesticide risk. And this can, for example, be by substituting products, using more efficient machinery and so on. But we also have to create new pathways in between. And this was why this, I think, pesticide-free production program is so important. And what I wanted to highlight, it's something in between conventional and organic. So you have two extremes at the moment on the market, but you don't have a middle way actually for farmers who would like to reduce, but they don't find actually a marketing channel where they could sell this kind of products, and they don't find any support. And another insight, I think, is that once those practices are more established, then it's also easier to adopt, and also for farmers who have more higher adoption barriers, actually, because then you have actually what's the big barrier is, for example, the knowledge and the insecurity. If you have a neighbor who has already since 2-3 years been adopting this kind of practices, and you can see that in certain situations yield are not totally abolished, and that he uses a certain kind of machinery, he can give you tips, you can maybe even share the machinery and so on. This already reduces adoption barriers by a lot. So I think it's a kind of this innovation diffusion process that you have to start somewhere, actually. And once you are establishing this on a large scale, this will actually kind of be a process that also helps itself again and gets bigger and bigger. And I think that's why it's important to actually have a low, say a low cost program for the farmers in place where they can start adopting, and they can actually see that you can produce without any pesticides. And then one day they might be able to actually go to organic or to use other crops like this and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Niklas, and Julie. Thank you so much, Julie, for your discussion. We have a lot of questions. I have also some of my questions, but I will leave maybe first question from Thomas. Thomas, you raise your hand. You can ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi Niklas, thanks for your presentation. Very interesting. I didn't know that program. My question is about the cropping practices that the farmer may employ for achieving this pesticide-free wheat production. You didn't say much about those cropping practices. I wondered whether there would be some changes in crop rotations that farmer may employ. The reason of my question is that the changes in crop rotations, if they exist, may have some consequences for pesticide use or cost or benefits or food security when it's estimated over the whole rotation. And I wondered whether you accounted for this kind of displacement effects.
Niklas, short answer, please. Very short answer.
It's a good question, because you always have this extensive and intensive margin effects, and in the past we've also been looking at that. So we cannot say it in practice because it's already in place. It's 2 years, but we have been asking this question the farmers also, and I think around 10-15% were actually willing to change their crop rotation, and we also asked them if they want to increase pesticide use after and before, because it's possible in this kind of program. And actually, there were only quite a low number of participants who wanted to do that. So I think there might be some effects, but it's not able to foresee that yet, but they might be limited, I think, because they all actually have quite good tools in place already, like I said, adopted varieties and so on, and they actually used to this kind of production already. But if you want more information, you can contact me also, and we can talk about this.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have Patrice. You could ask your question maybe, but very short one.
Yes, my question is on the trade-off between yield decrease and decrease in fertilizer, in pesticides and herbicide. Here, the decrease in yield is quite substantial, which means that there will be additional land use needed to keep up with the production. How was that communicated, that the trade-off between deforestation somewhere else and the reduction in pesticide and herbicide? How was that communicated with the farmers, and how was that discussed? And does it, because of that trade-off, the environmental effect is not so clear? Do you have some in this case, was there some discussion on that, some interrogation and so on and so forth? Do you have something to say on that subject?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think what's
short answer, please. Very short one. Thank you.
What's important to notice is that actually those farmers were producing extensive wheat before. And if you see in my table, the difference between extensive and pesticide-free was actually very, very low. So that's 0.2 tons per hectare or something like this. So that was only 5%, I think. So actually that's why actually the step was not so hard anymore. This environmental effect, of course, per ton or per hectare, it's important to discuss. And there was a non-published study on comparing that with organic, and it had a better environmental footprint than organic production, for example. But again, I would argue for different pathways that are adopted to different kind of production situations. And I think, yeah, that's also something we might learn or might have learned from Federico's presentation.
Thank you, Patrice and Niklas. Sarah, do you have your micro is on now? You can ask your question.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Go on.
I was very impressed by the combination of like social and ecological perspectives on these topics and the wide range of studies that you presented. So I was just posing the question, how do you think we could promote these type of interdisciplinary studies beyond like specific projects like the one you're collaborating with or being part of? Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm maybe a bit biased in my perspective, but of course I think that's the future because we're living in such a complex world, in such a complex agro-ecosystem, and we are beginning to see that actually more and more that when we don't take into account this kind of trade-offs, and that you can actually design a very nice and very good-looking program, but if you don't take into account, for example, trade-offs in the socio-ecosystem, or if you don't take into account the farmer behavior, then nobody might adopt this kind of program. So it's very important to look at actually what are the actors actually doing, what are decision-making processes, and so on. For me, that's a central question, to actually design programs that are effective and efficient, so that can actually change something in the real world. But of course, I'm also biased in my perspective, but I think that's very important research.
Okay, thank you, Niklas. I have a few questions, so I will allow myself to take a few minutes, even if we are late. Yeah, I was wondering, I have two questions actually. I didn't see in your results how farmers, the share farmers who choose the organic versus pesticide-free, because I was thinking about the relationship between fertilizers and pesticides. Some studies show that it could be substitute. So how it would affect the result in terms of if you have less or free pesticide, do you put more fertilizers or no? This was my first question. The second one is, as I said before, the ecophyto in the case of France didn't work. So I was wondering why it works in the Swiss case. Maybe the Swiss government is very rich and you give a lot of money to compensate the farmers. And I was wondering how the compensation were calculated. Did you the government, you take into account only compensation on yield, or also you include the reduction in costs in terms of environment or health, which could be induced by pesticides? Thank you.
So thanks for the questions. The first question on the substitution or effect. So I think in general, if we go again to this extensor production, which is quite well studied since 30 years, they actually see that both are lower. So it's more kind of an extensive production program where you actually reduce costs, you reduce input costs, you have a lower yield, but in the end you have a higher revenue. So that's kind of a more extensive program. And actually in a paper together with Esther Devilliers, who was a PhD student of Alain in Rennes, we're actually looking closer at this. So once this is published, I can send this to you. The second question was, of course, Switzerland, it's not perfect at all. So there also you are not actually fulfilling this kind of goals. I think an important difference maybe to the European Union is that the Swiss policy system, they have this kind of Tinbergen policy where they have for each policy goal a separate policy measure. So this makes the system quite flexible actually. So once they noted that this kind of programs might come on the market, they actually said, okay, we will put in place a specific direct payment which will help this kind of producers to adopt this kind of programs. And I think this makes sense in this context because in the European Union, we actually don't have a specific direct payment which will reduce pesticide use or something like that. And maybe with the reform of the CAP, we will have that, but not yet. And so I think a key player here was actually this producer organization. Not only the Swiss state, because only, like I said before, you need this whole food value chain. You can give farmers a lot of money, but if they don't have this marketing channel, if they don't have the trust in the actors, then they would never adopt this kind of program on a long term, because I mean, for them, it's also an investment decision on a long run, you have to see.
Just a very quick questions, and it's more like a reasoning for everyone, but may actually Niklas may be interested in this, and also the next speakers, Alain. So we always reason in terms of farming and agriculture, but probably we are neglecting that there is a lot of pesticides used on livestock and also in aquaculture. So my question for Niklas, maybe for later discussion, but I anticipate my question for Alain, is whether the policy making is already directing a little bit of the attention to design the policies also for the best practices in other fields than soil agriculture, like aquaculture, for example, and livestock production systems. So if there is an answer now, it's fine. Otherwise, maybe Alain later can also take on back the conversation.
Thank you very much, Federico. This is a very good question. I don't know if Niklas, you have any elements. Otherwise, it will be Alain who will try to answer.
I'm not an expert for agriculture, I have to say, but I also agree it's an important question, and I think this same kind of reasoning also applies there. But you always have to know the production system very well to design a kind of program. So I would not be a suitable partner probably to give you a good answer, but I would refer to somebody else.